The sky hung heavy with violet clouds as the carriage rattled through the twisted, frost-covered forest. Inside, the young Omega sat quietly, her hands pressed against her knees, staring out at the shadowy world. Her heart thudded with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She had been taken far from everything she knew, brought to a kingdom whispered about in tales of darkness and power, a kingdom ruled by the Alpha King, a man whose name alone made villagers tremble. She had heard stories of him, of his unmatched strength, his intelligence, and his ruthlessness. Yet even in the frightful tales, there was a strange allure, a legend that no one could touch him without consequences. And now, she would see him for herself. The carriage came to a sudden halt. Outside, 2 armored guards stood silently, their faces hidden beneath polished helmets. The Omega swallowed nervously as the door opened, revealing a world she had never imagined. The castle loomed like a jagged crown, its black stones reaching toward the sky as if clawing at the clouds. Torches flickered along the walls, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cold ground. The guards moved with precision, their boots echoing against the stone floor as they led her inside. The halls were vast, silent, except for the occasional drip of water from somewhere above. Tapestries of deep crimson and black lined the walls, depicting kings and warriors long gone, their faces stern, their eyes seeming to follow her every step. And then she saw him. The Alpha King sat atop a throne carved from dark obsidian, his presence filling the hall like a storm. His eyes, sharp and piercing, studied her carefully, as if measuring every inch of her soul. She could feel the weight of his gaze pressing against her chest. He was not merely a man, he was an embodiment of power and command. Every movement, every subtle gesture exuded dominance. "You are here," he said, his voice low, deep, and commanding. "Do you know why?" The Omega's throat went dry. She shook her head, unsure what to say. "You will learn," he continued, leaning forward slightly, his dark hair falling over his brow. "In this place, words are not enough. Actions speak, and actions have consequences." The guards stepped back, leaving her alone with him. She felt an involuntary shiver run down her spine, torn between fear and fascination. There was something magnetic about him, something dangerous yet irresistible. He stood, moving toward her with silent authority. Every step seemed measured, deliberate, and heavy with expectation. She wanted to step back, but the walls of the throne room offered no escape. "You are far from your village," he said, pausing just a few feet away. "And yet, I sense courage in you. That courage may serve you, or destroy you." She met his gaze, trying to mask the tremor in her hands. I do not understand why I am here," she said softly. He smiled faintly, a hint of something dark and unspoken crossing his features. "Understanding comes with time," he said. "But for now, you must obey the rules of this kingdom, and the first rule is simple. Nothing here is as it seems." The Omega swallowed hard, realizing that she was entering a world ruled not just by power, but by forces she could barely imagine. She was a stranger in a place that demanded respect, fear, and submission to its own mysterious laws. That night, she was taken to her quarters, a small room with stone walls and a single window high above, letting in slivers of moonlight. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, carrying whispers that seemed almost alive. She sat on the edge of the simple bed, pressing her hands against her lap, trying to steady her racing heart. Her thoughts drifted back to the king. There was an intensity in his eyes that unsettled her, yet also drew her in. She could not explain it, but she felt as though he had already seen into the deepest parts of her soul. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the far wall. She gasped, spinning toward it, only to find the king standing at the door, his presence silent but undeniable. "You wonder," he said quietly. "What I see in you. Do you?" She hesitated, unsure if speaking would be wise. The truth, however, spilled from her lips despite her fear. I do not know, but I feel something." He tilted his head, regarding her carefully. "Yes," he said, "and that feeling is dangerous. In this kingdom, emotions are not merely private. They are weapons, and you have already touched one that I have long tried to forget." Her heart skipped. The weight of his words settled over her like a storm cloud. She felt small, fragile, yet strangely alive, as if some part of her had been awakened that she could not control. "You will learn," he said, his voice softening slightly but carrying an edge she could not ignore. "By morning, you will understand why resistance is both futile and necessary. Only then can you survive." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadowed corridors, leaving her alone with the echo of his presence. She sank onto the bed, the fear inside her mingling with something unnameable, something that made her pulse quicken. Sleep did not come easily. The shadows in her room seemed to stretch and bend, whispering secrets of the castle and the king who ruled it. She wondered how a man could hold such power and yet carry such loneliness. She wondered if, beneath the mask of the Alpha, there was a part of him that yearned for connection, for understanding. When the first pale light of dawn filtered through her window, the castle was silent, save for the soft footsteps of the guards. She rose slowly, her hands brushing against the stone wall, and prepared herself for whatever the day would bring. Outside her window, the mist clung to the castle walls like a living thing. Somewhere in its depths, she could feel the presence of the king, watching, waiting, testing. She did not know what trials lay ahead, but one thing was certain. Her life had changed forever the moment she entered this castle. And somewhere, deep within the shadows of the throne room, the Alpha King stood and watched the first light touch the world, his thoughts consumed by the fragile Omega, who had so unexpectedly stirred something long buried within him. By the end of that morning, neither of them would be the same. Fear, fascination, and something far more dangerous were beginning to take root. A bond forged not by choice, but by fate, destiny, and the unyielding forces that ruled their lives. As the wind whispered through the high towers, carrying a promise of trials yet to come, the king's voice echoed in the corridors, low and commanding. "Today, you will begin to understand the true nature of power and the cost of heart." And with that, the castle seemed to breathe, alive with secrets, shadows, and the silent, unspoken tension between two souls drawn together by fate, a tension that neither time nor distance could easily undo. The castle was quieter than usual that morning. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense clouds that clung to the turrets and towers, casting long shadows across the stone floors. The Omega moved through the corridors, her hands brushing along the cold walls as she tried to memorize every turn and doorway. She had learned quickly that in a place ruled by power and vigilance, knowledge of your surroundings was a lifeline. The Alpha King did not appear in the hallways as she walked, but she could feel him. His presence lingered in the air, like the faint echo of a storm long past, subtle yet undeniable. Every step she took felt watched, measured, tested. She did not fully understand why, but it was clear that he was observing her every move, and that knowledge made her both nervous and strangely alive. Hours passed in careful, measured routines. The Omega was allowed to walk the castle grounds under the watchful eyes of the guards. The gardens were overgrown, twisted with thorny vines and blackened blooms that seemed almost alive. A bitter wind tugged at her cloak as she moved among the plants, their strange shapes casting shadows that danced across the gravel paths. Suddenly, she sensed a movement behind her. Turning sharply, she found the Alpha King standing at the edge of the garden, his dark cloak rippling in the wind. His presence was commanding, yet he did not approach her immediately. He simply watched, his eyes calculating, intense, yet betraying a faint curiosity. "You are brave to wander here," he said, his voice low, carrying both warning and intrigue. She straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I am not afraid," she said, though her voice betrayed the slightest quiver. He took a step closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "Not afraid," he repeated, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Curious, perhaps, and curiosity can be dangerous." "I need to understand this place," she said, her voice steadier now. "I cannot survive if I do not know what I face." The king regarded her for a long moment, as if weighing her words, her spirit, and her very essence. Then he nodded slowly. "Perhaps you are wiser than I first believed. Many who enter these walls do not last long. They are broken by fear, by the unknown, by the weight of this kingdom." "I do not wish to be broken," she said softly. "I wish to live." The Alpha King's expression softened, though only slightly. For a moment, the ruthless ruler seemed almost human, a man shaped by solitude and centuries of command. "Living," he said quietly, "requires more than courage. It requires understanding, and sometimes sacrifice." A silence fell between them, broken only by the rustling of the strange trees in the wind. The Omega felt her heart quicken. There was something magnetic about him, something that pulled at her very soul. She knew she was drawn to him, despite the fear, despite the warnings of the villagers who spoke his name in hushed tones. "You will face trials," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Tests that will push you to the edge of fear and hope. And in these trials you will discover truths about yourself and about me." She frowned slightly. "Truths about you?" "Yes," he said. "I am not as simple as I appear. Neither is this castle, and neither are you." His gaze softened, lingering on her with a rare tenderness that made her pulse quicken. "The world outside is cruel, but the world within these walls is a different kind of danger. Here, trust is fragile, and survival is earned." The Omega nodded, sensing the weight of his words. "I understand," she said, though deep down, she knew she only understood a fraction of the truths he spoke. For days, she adjusted to the rhythms of the castle, learning its paths, its rules, its dangers. The Alpha King observed from a distance, testing her resolve without her knowing. He watched as she adapted, as she resisted fear, as she confronted the shadows that seemed almost alive within the stone walls. One evening, the wind carried the faint sound of music through the corridors. The king led her to the grand hall, its windows open to the night, the pale moonlight spilling across the polished stone floor. Candles flickered along the walls, casting soft light that made the shadows dance. "This hall," he said, "has seen generations of kings, queens, and warriors. And it has seen countless moments of loyalty, betrayal, and courage. Tonight, you will learn something important." He stepped forward, his cloak brushing the floor. "There is magic here," he said, gesturing to the flickering shadows. "Old magic, bound to this kingdom, to this throne, and to me. It responds to strength, to intent, and to spirit. It will challenge you, test you, and reveal truths you cannot ignore." The Omega's breath caught. She felt the weight of his words pressing against her, heavy yet invigorating. "I am ready," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. He studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he lifted his hand, and the shadows in the room shifted, forming shapes that seemed to move of their own accord. Whispers floated on the wind, soft and melodic, carrying hints of secrets long forgotten. The Omega stepped forward, feeling the pull of the magic, the pulse of the room. the silent expectations that hung in the air. "You must face it," the king said, his voice both command and encouragement. "And you must face yourself. Only then will you understand the balance of fear and strength, of control and surrender." The shadows coiled around her, yet she did not retreat. Instead, she reached out, her hand steady despite the tingling fear that ran through her. The magic responded to her touch, swirling and bending, revealing visions of the past, of the king, and of herself. She saw the loneliness that had shaped him, the weight of decisions made, of lives changed, of hearts broken. She saw her own courage, her own fear, and her own determination reflected back at her. And in that moment, she understood something she had not before. The king was not merely a ruler, he was a man bound by destiny, by choices, and by a past he could not fully escape. The Alpha King stepped closer, his presence a shadow against the moonlight. "Do you see now?" he asked softly. "Do you see why this kingdom is not for the faint of heart?" She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I see," she said, "and I see you. Not as a tyrant, but as someone shaped by his choices, someone who carries burdens I cannot imagine." He regarded her silently, the intensity of his gaze cutting through her like sunlight through mist. "Few have ever seen that side of me," he said. "Fewer still have the courage to face it without turning away." For a moment, the world outside the hall ceased to exist. There was only them, the magic, and the unspoken connection that had begun to grow, fragile yet undeniable. "You are different," he said finally, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "And I am not sure what that means for me." The Omega's heart ached with understanding. She had seen the man beneath the king's mask, and she could not turn away. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "it means we must learn together." He studied her, a flicker of something unspoken passing across his face. Then, without another word, he stepped back, letting the shadows fall once more across the hall. The magic calmed, retreating into corners, leaving only the memory of its presence. The Omega left the hall that night with a sense of both fear and hope. She had glimpsed the truth of the king, and it had stirred something within her, a mixture of curiosity, compassion, and the faintest trace of longing. She knew the road ahead would be dangerous, filled with trials that would test her courage, her resolve, and her heart. And she knew that the king was watching, as he always did, his thoughts tangled between duty, desire, and the rare spark of connection that he had not felt in centuries. In the stillness of the night, as the castle slept and the wind whispered through the towers, both of them understood that their lives were no longer their own. A bond had begun, delicate and perilous, fragile yet undeniable. A bond that would shape their destinies, and perhaps the fate of the kingdom itself. The mist lay thick over the castle grounds, curling around the towers like ghostly fingers. The Omega walked carefully along the stone path that led to the edge of the cursed forest, her heart beating with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The Alpha King had summoned her here, saying only that today she would face a trial that could change everything. The forest was alive in a way that made her skin prickle. Shadows moved beneath the gnarled trees, and the wind carried strange whispers, as though the forest itself were speaking. She had heard tales of the dangers within these woods. Creatures born of magic and shadow, guardians of the kingdom's secrets, and tests that would push any soul to the brink. "Do not falter." The king's voice came from behind her, deep and commanding, yet calm. He stepped closer, the fog swirling around him. "This is not merely a test of courage. It is a test of heart. What you choose, what you feel, and how you respond will decide your path here." She turned slightly, catching sight of him through the mist. His eyes were dark, intense, and strangely soft, betraying the burden he carried. "I am ready," she said, though a tremor ran through her hands. "Good," he said. "Then step forward. Trust yourself, and trust what you have learned." The Omega took a deep breath and entered the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches creating tunnels of shadow. The air was thick with magic, humming softly, and the path beneath her feet seemed to shift as if testing her resolve. Suddenly, a voice called out, soft and melodic, echoing through the trees. "Turn back. You do not belong here." The Omega's heart raced, but she pressed on. She remembered the king's words, the lessons she had begun to understand in the castle. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was the willingness to face it. Ahead, the shadows took form. Dark shapes emerged, twisting and coiling, their eyes glinting with an unnatural light. They moved in silence, circling her, testing her balance. Her resolve, her heart. She stood her ground, recalling the king's presence, the trust she had begun to place in him. "Do not let them control you," his voice echoed in her mind. "Control yourself, and you will control the outcome." The Omega lifted her hands, focusing on the energy around her. She remembered the magic in the grand hall, how it responded to courage, to intent, to the clarity of heart. Slowly she reached out, letting her will guide the shadows. They hesitated, recoiling slightly as if surprised by her strength. A surge of confidence filled her. The shadows began to dissolve, retreating into the trees. She moved forward, deeper into the forest, until she reached a small clearing. There, in the center, was a pool of water, black as night, reflecting the moon and stars above. The Alpha King stepped into the clearing behind her, silent and commanding as ever. "This is the final part of your trial," he said. "Look into the water and face the truth of your heart. Only then will you understand the bond between us and the power that binds this kingdom." The Omega knelt beside the pool, gazing into its surface. Slowly, the water shimmered, revealing visions, her past, her fears, her hopes, and her courage. And then, as she looked closer, she saw him, not the Alpha King, the ruler, the figure of power, but the man beneath. She saw his loneliness, the weight of centuries, the burden of his choices, and she saw how those choices had shaped him, how they had built walls around his heart, walls she could feel but could also reach. "You see now," he said softly, kneeling beside her. His hand hovered near hers, not touching, yet close enough that she felt the warmth of his presence. Few have ever looked beyond the mask. Few have dared to see the man within. And fewer still have done so without fear, without judgment, without turning away. The Omega's breath caught. She had not expected this closeness, this vulnerability. I see you," she whispered, "and I understand, more than I should, perhaps." He smiled faintly, the edges of his expression softening, though the intensity of his gaze never wavered. "Understanding is the first step," he said. "Trust is the second. And connection. Connection is the third most dangerous step of all." A sudden wind rustled through the clearing, sending ripples across the water. The shadows from earlier re-emerged, more forceful this time, as if angered by her insight, by her courage. They surged toward her, and she instinctively raised her hands, focusing her mind, her intent, her heart. "Do not struggle alone," the king's voice commanded. "You are not alone. I am here, and I will not let you fall." For the first time, she felt the strength of his presence beside her. Not as a ruler, not as a figure of fear, but as a companion in the trial, a protector, a guide. Together, they faced the shadows. Together, they pushed them back until the forest fell silent once more. Breathless, the Omega sank to her knees, her hands trembling. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown, and she had survived. But more importantly, she had faced herself and the truth of her heart. The king stood over her, watching her with a quiet intensity. "You have done well," he said. Few could have survived this trial with both courage and clarity. Few could have faced not only the forest, but themselves with such strength. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "It was not just me," she said softly. "It was you, too. You guided me, even when I could not see it." He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words without breaking his composure. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps you simply discovered what was already inside you, courage, heart, and the will to endure, qualities that will serve you well, and qualities that have drawn me to you in ways I did not expect." The Omega's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken connection that had grown between them over days, over trials, over moments of shared silence and understanding. She realized that what had begun as fear was transforming into something more complex, something that stirred her very soul. A sudden rustle in the trees drew their attention. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a messenger of the kingdom, cloaked and silent, bearing a scroll sealed with the Alpha King's emblem. He handed it to the king, who broke the seal and read it swiftly. His expression darkened, a shadow crossing his face. "The threat we anticipated is closer than I feared," he said quietly. "A force from the old world, one that may challenge not only us, but the balance of this kingdom." The Omega's heart raced. She had survived the forest trial, discovered the truth of her own strength, and glimpsed the man beneath the king's mask. And yet, a new danger had arrived, one that could test them both in ways neither had yet imagined. He folded the scroll and handed it to a nearby guard. "Prepare immediately," he said. "We may need to leave the castle or defend it. Either way, the choice will not be ours alone. Fate has already begun to decide." The Omega looked at him, seeing the tension in his posture, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, and a flicker of something more. Fear, perhaps, or concern for her. She realized in that moment that their bond, delicate and fragile as it was, might soon be tested in ways neither had anticipated. "You are ready?" he said softly, almost to himself. Then, turning to her, he added, "But readiness is not enough. Courage, heart, and trust will be your true weapons in the trials to come." As they left the forest, the mist curling behind them like living shadows, the Omega understood that she had crossed a threshold. She had faced the unknown, discovered her own strength, and glimpsed the man beneath the king's formidable exterior. And in the quiet of the misty morning, she realized that their connection, unexpected, fragile, and dangerous, was only just beginning. The Alpha King walked beside her, silent yet attentive, a presence both commanding and protective. Together, they returned to the castle, aware that the coming days would bring challenges that would test every lesson she had learned and every emotion they had dared to feel. And in the shadows, beyond the walls of the castle, a distant threat watched and waited, its intent unknown, its power growing. The Omega's journey was far from over, and the Alpha King's past, present, and heart would soon collide with forces that neither could ignore. The castle had never felt so quiet, yet so tense. Dawn had not yet broken, and the first pale light of day was swallowed by the heavy mist curling around the towers. Inside, the Alpha King stood at the edge of the throne room, the weight of the coming battle pressing on his broad shoulders. He had faced countless threats, fought wars, and commanded obedience from hundreds, yet this force, ancient and cunning, brought unease even to him. The Omega moved beside him, steady and composed despite the fear bubbling in her chest. The forest trial had strengthened her, awakened a courage she had not known existed. She had faced shadows, faced the unknown, and faced the truth of the king himself. Now, standing at the edge of the kingdom's destiny, she understood the depth of the power they both carried, and the bond that had grown between them. "Are you certain you can do this?" the king asked, his voice low but carrying authority and concern. "I am," she replied softly. "I am not afraid." He studied her, the intensity in his dark eyes softened by the faintest trace of admiration. "You are more than I imagined," he admitted. "And yet, bravery alone will not be enough. This is not a test of courage, but of heart, will, and trust." Together they stepped into the grand hall. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long shadows as the distant sound of movement reached their ears. The enemy had come, an ancient force from the old world, bent on reclaiming power and breaking the bonds of the kingdom. The Alpha King drew himself to his full height, his cloak sweeping the floor behind him. "Stay close," he instructed. "We face this together, as equals, as allies, as something more than either of us expected." The Omega nodded, feeling the surge of confidence the king inspired. She had seen the man beneath the ruler, the man capable of compassion, care, and a rare vulnerability. And now she would stand beside him in the storm. From the shadows emerged shapes, cloaked in dark energy, their forms shifting and indistinct. The whispers of the forest trial had returned, louder now, more insistent, as if testing every heartbeat and every decision they would make. The king extended a hand, not as a ruler commanding obedience, but as a companion offering trust. The Omega took it, feeling the warmth of his presence. Together they stepped forward, their hearts aligned, their courage intertwined. The shadows surged forward, swirling like a dark river seeking to overwhelm them. The Omega lifted her hands, drawing on the lessons of the forest. She focused her intent, her will and her heart, channeling it through the energy around her. The shadows recoiled, hissing and twisting, yet they were persistent. The king moved beside her, his strength and presence a shield. With each step, each gesture, he guided the flow of energy, merging his power with hers. The shadows resisted, but the unity of their bond pushed back the darkness, bending it, shaping it, until it no longer felt like a threat, but a force they could control together. "You are stronger than you know," the king said, his voice a calm anchor amidst the chaos. "And stronger with me at your side." She looked at him, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. "And you are not alone," she replied. "Not anymore." The final surge of shadows hit, a wave of energy that threatened to topple them both. They braced, hearts synchronized, wills united. Then, with a single thought, a single intention, they pushed back, sending the shadows retreating into the corners of the room, into the cracks of the ancient walls. Silence returned, heavy and profound. The Omega sank to her knees, breathless but triumphant. She had faced fear, darkness, and uncertainty, and she had not wavered. She looked up at the king who stood before her, his chest heaving slightly, his dark eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "You did it," he said quietly, a rare smile touching his features. "You faced the trial, the shadows, and even yourself, and you emerged stronger than I dared hope." She rose slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "We did it," she corrected gently. "Together." For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, standing amidst the echoes of darkness they had conquered. Their bond, forged through trial and trust, was undeniable now. No words were needed. The connection between them spoke louder than any declaration. The king extended his hand once more, this time inviting, not commanding. She placed hers in his, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the warmth, the presence, the undeniable pull between them. "Perhaps," he said softly, almost to himself, "there is more to this life than power and duty. Perhaps there is a place for something like this." The Omega's heart stirred. "I believe there is," she said, "if we choose it." He nodded, and in that simple gesture, centuries of isolation, of burden, and of fear began to lift. He had faced the darkest parts of his kingdom, of his own heart, and now he was opening himself to something he had thought impossible: connection, trust, and hope. Beyond the walls, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the mist, scattering the shadows, revealing the world anew. The king and Omega stood together, hand in hand, their bond a beacon of strength and transformation. They had faced trials, darkness, and fear, and they had emerged not broken, but united. Yet even as they embraced this newfound peace, a subtle ripple in the air suggested that the world's magic, its mysteries, and its ancient forces were never fully at rest. They had won this battle, but the kingdom was alive, watching, waiting. And in that knowledge lay the promise of challenges yet to come. A reminder that their bond, though strong, would need care, courage, and trust to endure. The king gazed down at the Omega, his expression softening. "You have changed me," he said quietly. "Not because of who I am, but because of who you are. And perhaps that is the greatest power of all." She looked up at him, a smile playing on her lips, her eyes filled with understanding and admiration. "And you have changed me," she said. "Not by command, but by showing me courage, strength, and a heart I did not know could exist in this world." They walked to the high balcony overlooking the castle grounds. The mist curled like silver smoke around the towers, the sunlight casting long shadows that promised new beginnings. The world felt vast, full of possibility, yet grounded by the bond they now shared. They were no longer captive and ruler, teacher and student, master and subject. They were companions, allies, and equals, bound by trials, trust, and the fragile, beautiful beginnings of love. As they stood together, the wind carried a distant sound, soft, almost imperceptible, yet charged with a sense of purpose. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a new challenge waited. But for the first time, neither of them faced it alone. Together they had faced darkness and emerged stronger, their hearts aligned and their spirits unbroken. The Alpha King turned to the Omega, a rare, unguarded smile illuminating his features. "The world may test us again," he said, "but I know now that we can endure, because together we are stronger than anything this kingdom, or fate, can throw at us." The Omega smiled in return, her hand tightening in his. "And we will face it," she said, "with courage, with heart, and with each other." The sunlight grew brighter, scattering the last of the mist, bathing the castle in a warm glow. For the first time in centuries, the Alpha King felt something he had thought impossible: hope. Not the fleeting hope of power or the brittle hope of survival, but the steady, enduring hope of connection, trust, and the promise of a future shared. And the Omega, once a captive, now stood as his equal, her heart fearless, her spirit unbroken, and her courage shining as brightly as the morning sun. In that moment, the kingdom seemed to breathe in unison with them, shadows retreating, light prevailing, and the bond between Alpha King and Omega sealed, not by command, not by fear, but by trust, courage, and the rare, undeniable spark of something greater than either could have imagined.